My son found a letter in the fireplace. It was addressed to someone who never existed. I found my son standing in the stone hearth with ash on his hands. He held a piece of paper the size of a postcard, edges charred black and curling inward. The light through the cabin window caught the handwriting, and I knew it before I crossed the room. My wife's looped script, unmistakable even from 10 feet away. He looked up at me with a question already forming, but I took the letter from him without a word and read the name at the top. Daniel. Not our son's name, not mine, not anyone I had ever known in 32 years of marriage. My son asked who Daniel was. I folded the paper once, creased it flat between my thumb and forefinger, and told him I didn't know. He wiped his palms on his jeans and went back to sorting the firewood. I slipped the letter into my shirt pocket and felt the stiff edge press against my ribs for the rest of the afternoon. When we finished loading the truck and locked the cabin door behind us, I could still feel it there, a splinter of a question I had not asked and could not answer. She had been gone 8 months. Cancer, swift and unrelenting, the kind that gives you just enough time to say what you think needs saying, and then takes even that from you. We had cleared her things from the house in stages, room by room, drawer by drawer, the way you dismantle a life when you cannot bear to do it all at once. The cabin had been hers before it was ours. Her father built it in the 70s, and she spent summers there as a girl. We brought the kids when they were small, and after they grew and moved away, we went alone. I thought I knew every corner of it, every loose board and rusted hinge. I had swept that fireplace 100 times. I sat at the kitchen table that night after my son went to bed. The letter lay flat under the lamp. The paper was brittle, browned at the edges, and smelled faintly of smoke and something older, something like cedar or dried flowers. The ink had faded, but the words were legible. It began without preamble. Daniel, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before. I thought if I waited long enough, I'd find the right words, but they never came. I hope you understand why I had to leave it this way. The rest was obscured by a burn that ate through the middle of the page, leaving only fragments. A phrase about summer, a mention of a place I didn't recognize. The closing was intact. Always, even when I couldn't say it. No signature, but I knew her hand the way I knew the sound of her voice. I set the letter down and pressed my palms against the table. The grain of the wood was familiar under my fingertips, smooth in some places, rough in others. I'd built this table 20 years ago, sanded it by hand, finished it with oil that darkened the oak to the color of honey. She had sat here every morning with her coffee, reading the paper or staring out the window at the garden. She tended with the same quiet attention she gave to everything. I thought I had known her. I thought we had built a life without secrets, or at least without the kind that required hiding. The letter in front of me suggested otherwise, and the not knowing sat in my chest like a stone. I thought about waking my son and showing him the rest of it, asking if he remembered anything, any name or story that might fit. But he was 26 and living 4 states away, and this was not his burden to carry. I folded the letter back into my pocket and turned off the lamp. Sleep came eventually, thin and restless, and when I woke before dawn, the first thought I had was the name. Daniel. The cabin belonged to her, but the paperwork lived in a file box in the basement, along with deeds and insurance policies and the accumulated documentation of a shared life. I went down after breakfast and pulled the box from its shelf. The air in the basement was cool and smelled of concrete and old cardboard. I set the box on the workbench and opened it under the utility light. The deed was on top, dated to the year her father died. Beneath it were tax records, repair receipts, a survey map with the property lines drawn in red ink. I sifted through each sheet, looking for anything that didn't fit, any reference to a name or a transaction I didn't recognize. At the bottom of the box, I found a manila envelope I had never seen before. It was sealed, the flap yellowed and brittle. I worked it open carefully and shook out the contents. 3 photographs, all of them old enough that the colors had shifted toward amber and blue. The first showed the cabin from the road, trees smaller than I remembered, the porch bare. The second was my wife as a young woman, maybe 20, standing beside a car I didn't recognize. She wore jeans and a plaid shirt, her hair longer than she ever kept it in the years I knew her. She was smiling, but the smile was guarded, the kind you offer when the camera catches you off balance. The third photograph stopped me. She stood beside a man I had never seen. He was tall, dark-haired, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They were in front of the cabin, the same angle as the first photo, the same light filtering through the trees. She looked at him, not at the camera, and the expression on her face was one I had seen before, but not directed at me. Not quite. I set the photos on the bench and studied the man's face. He was young, maybe her age in the picture, with sharp features and a calm, steady gaze. There was nothing familiar about him. I turned the photograph over. No date, no name, no inscription. Just the blank white back of the print, slightly warped with age. I looked at the other photos again, searching for context, for anything that would tell me who he was or why she had kept these hidden. The envelope had been sealed, tucked away in a box I rarely opened, beneath papers that rarely moved. She had meant for this to stay buried. I put the photos back in the envelope and carried it upstairs. The letter sat on the kitchen table where I had left it. I placed the envelope beside it and sat down. The man in the photograph could have been Daniel. The name fit the era, fit the cabin, fit the careful way she had folded this piece of her life away from mine. I did not know what to do with that possibility. I did not know what it meant or what I was supposed to feel. Anger seemed too simple, grief too familiar. What I felt was something closer to disorientation, the sense that the ground I had walked on for 3 decades had shifted, and I was only now noticing the tilt. I called the only person I thought might know. Her sister, Anne, lived 2 hours north in a town she had never left. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and immediate, and I asked if she had a minute to talk. She said of course, and I heard the sound of a door closing, the shift from a crowded room to somewhere quieter. I told her I had found something at the cabin, a letter with a name I didn't recognize. I asked if she knew who Daniel was. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Where did you find it?" I told her. She was quiet again, and I could hear her breathing, careful and measured. She asked if I was alone. I said I was. She told me to wait, and the line clicked off. She called back 20 minutes later and said she needed to see the letter. I offered to scan it and send it to her, but she said no, she would come down. She asked if tomorrow was too soon. I told her tomorrow was fine. She said she would be there by noon and hung up before I could ask anything else. I set the phone on the table and looked at the letter again. The name Daniel seemed heavier now, loaded with something I could not yet define. I had the sense that I was standing at the edge of something, and the only way forward was to keep walking. Anne arrived a few minutes past noon. She drove a small silver sedan that I didn't recognize, and she parked it beside the garage with the precision of someone who had thought about the visit all the way down. She got out slowly, straightened her coat, and walked to the front door without looking around. I opened it before she knocked. She hugged me briefly, the way you embrace someone you care for but do not know how to comfort, and stepped inside. She asked where the letter was. I pointed to the kitchen table. She sat down without taking off her coat and picked up the letter. She read it twice, her lips moving slightly, and then set it down and pressed her fingers against her forehead. "I thought she burned it," she said. I sat down across from her and waited. She looked at the letter again, then at me, and I could see her deciding how much to say. She folded her hands on the table, fingers laced tightly together, and began. Daniel was someone my wife had known before me, before marriage, before the life we built, before any of the years I had thought of as the whole story. They met the summer she turned 21, the year her father died, and left her the cabin. He was working construction in the area, part of a crew putting in a new road. They met at a diner, or maybe a gas station. Anne couldn't remember the exact place, but she remembered that my wife had come home different. Brighter, Anne said, but also more secretive. She stopped talking about the cabin, stopped inviting Anne to visit. When Anne finally drove up unannounced, she found my wife and Daniel together, living in the cabin like it was the only place that mattered. Anne paused and looked out the window. She said they were together for a summer, maybe a little more. It was intense, the kind of thing that feels like it will last forever when you're young and don't know better. But Daniel had to leave. Work, family, something pulled him away. My wife never said exactly what, and Anne never pressed. When he left, my wife packed up the cabin and came home. She didn't talk about him again. Anne thought it was over, finished, the way first loves finish when you grow up and move on. Then, 2 years later, my wife met me. We married quickly, built a life, had children. Anne thought Daniel was a closed chapter, something that belonged to the past and stayed there. I asked why she thought my wife had kept the letter. Anne shook her head. She said she didn't know, but she suspected my wife never really let go of him. Or maybe she needed to write it down to say the things she couldn't say when he left. Maybe she intended to send it and never did. Maybe she burned it and didn't realize a piece survived. Anne reached across the table and touched the edge of the letter with one finger. She said, "She loved you. I know she did, but I think part of her stayed in that summer." I asked if Anne knew where Daniel was now. She said she didn't. She had never met him, only heard about him in fragments, in the careful way my wife edited her own history. Anne didn't even know his last name. I asked if there was anyone else who might know, anyone my wife had stayed in touch with from that time. Anne thought for a moment, then said there was a woman named Grace, someone my wife had worked with at a shop in town that summer. Anne didn't know if Grace still lived in the area, but she thought it was worth trying. She pulled out her phone and searched, then wrote down an address on the back of an envelope. She said Grace would be older now, maybe not interested in talking about the past, but it was the only thread she could offer. Anne stayed for an hour, and we talked about other things, lighter things, the kinds of things you say when the heavy conversation is done and you're both trying to find your way back to normal. She asked about my son, about work, about whether I was eating enough. I answered the questions and asked a few of my own, and eventually she stood and said she needed to get back. She hugged me again at the door, longer this time, and told me to call if I needed anything. I watched her drive away, and then I went back inside and looked at the address she had written. Grace lived 40 minutes south, in a neighborhood I had driven through 100 times but never stopped in. I went the next morning. The house was small, pale yellow with white trim, a narrow porch with 2 chairs and a table between them. I parked on the street and walked up the driveway. The grass was cut short, the flower beds neat and mulched. I knocked, and a woman answered after a moment. She was older, maybe 70, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and glasses on a chain around her neck. I introduced myself and said I was looking for Grace. She studied me for a moment, then nodded, and said that was her. I told her I was married to someone she might have known a long time ago, and I gave my wife's name. Her expression shifted, softened, and she opened the door wider and invited me in. We sat in her living room, a space filled with books and quilts and the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from decades in one place. She offered tea, and I accepted, and while she was in the kitchen, I looked at the photographs on the mantel. None of them showed anyone I recognized. She came back with 2 mugs and set one in front of me, then sat down in the chair across from the sofa. She said she remembered my wife, said they had worked together at a bookstore that no longer existed, a place that sold used paperbacks and local crafts. She said my wife was quiet, serious, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. Grace asked how she was, and I told her she had passed. Grace set her mug down and was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was sorry. I asked if she remembered Daniel. Grace looked at me, and I saw recognition there, a flicker of something she had not expected to revisit. She said she remembered him. She said he and my wife had been close, closer than most people realized. Grace had met him a few times, always in passing, and she remembered thinking he was kind, steady, the sort of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the room. She said my wife talked about him the way you talk about someone who matters more than you're willing to admit. Grace said she thought they would get married, or at least that my wife thought so. But then he left, and my wife never mentioned him again. Grace had assumed it ended badly, the way young love often does, and she hadn't asked. I pulled the letter from my pocket and handed it to Grace. She read it slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back. She said she didn't know what had happened, but she suspected something more complicated than a simple breakup. She said my wife had come into the shop one day near the end of that summer looking different, hollowed out in a way that didn't match a broken heart. Grace asked if she was all right, and my wife said she was fine. but the way she said it made it clear she wasn't. Grace offered to listen, but my wife just shook her head and went back to work. A few weeks later, she quit and left town. Grace never saw her again. I asked if she knew Daniel's last name. Grace shook her head. She said she never heard it, or if she did, she didn't remember. She said he worked for a company that had a contract with the county, something to do with roads or bridges. She thought the company was based out of state, but she wasn't sure. She suggested I try the county office, said they might have records of contractors from that time. I thanked her and stood to leave. She walked me to the door and put a hand on my arm. She said, "Whatever you find, remember she chose you. She built a life with you. That matters." I drove to the county office the next day. It was a low brick building with a parking lot full of trucks and sedans, the kind of place that hums with bureaucracy and the weight of accumulated paperwork. I waited at the front desk until a clerk appeared, a young man with a badge that said his name was Eric. I explained that I was looking for records of construction contracts from the early 90s, specifically companies that worked on roads. He asked if I had a name or a date. I gave him the approximate year and said I was looking for a man named Daniel, no last name. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He said it would take some time and asked for my phone number. I gave it to him and left. He called 3 days later. He said he found several contracts from that period, but only one company had employed someone named Daniel. The company was called Barton & Sons, and they had done a resurfacing project on a county route that summer. The name listed on the payroll was Daniel Carver. Eric said the company was no longer in business, but he could send me a copy of the contract if I wanted. I said yes and gave him my email. The file arrived an hour later, a scanned PDF of a typewritten document with smudged ink and faded signatures. I printed it and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the name. Daniel Carver. I searched for him online. The name was common enough that the results were overwhelming. Pages of faces and profiles and obituaries that had nothing to do with the man in the photograph. I narrowed the search, adding the county name and the year, and found a single reference in a newspaper archive. It was a brief mention in a local weekly, a notice about the road project and the crew working on it. No photograph, just a list of names. Daniel Carver was fourth from the top. The notice was dated July, the same summer my wife had been at the cabin. I kept searching. I tried social media, public records, anything that might tell me where he had gone or what had become of him. The trail was thin, almost non-existent, as if he had stepped out of that summer and vanished. I found a property record in another state, a house purchased in the mid-90s under the name Daniel M. Carver. The address was in a small town I had never heard of, hours away. I copied the address and looked at it for a long time. I did not know what I would say if I found him. I did not know what I wanted from this or what it would change, but I knew I could not stop now. I told my son I was taking a trip. He asked where, and I said I needed to check on something, a loose end from the estate. He offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to do it alone. He didn't press, just said to call if I needed anything. I packed a small bag, filled the truck with gas, and left early on a Saturday morning. The drive took most of the day. I stopped once for coffee and once for gas, and the rest of the time I thought about what I would say, how I would explain why I was there. By the time I reached the town, the sun was low and the light had turned golden and soft. The address led me to a quiet street lined with maples and small houses set back from the road. The house was pale blue with a detached garage and a yard that looked recently mowed. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, trying to steady myself. Then I got out and walked up the driveway. I knocked on the door and waited. A woman answered. She was maybe 60 with short gray hair and a kind, tired face. I introduced myself and said I was looking for Daniel Carver. Her expression shifted, a flicker of confusion and then something guarded. She said he wasn't here. I asked if she knew where I could find him. She asked why I was looking for him. I hesitated, then said I had found something that belonged to him, or at least something he should know about. She studied me for a moment, then sighed and opened the door wider. She said he was her brother, and he had died 2 years ago. I stood there, the words settling in my chest like a weight. She asked if I wanted to come in. I nodded and followed her inside. The house was neat and spare, the kind of place that feels like it belongs to someone who has spent a long time alone. She offered me coffee, and I accepted. We sat at a small table in the kitchen, and she told me about him. Daniel had worked construction most of his life, moving from job to job, state to state. He never married, never settled in one place for long. He had lived with her for the last few years, after his health started to fail. She said he was quiet, private, the kind of person who kept his stories to himself. She asked what I had found that brought me here. I pulled the letter from my pocket and handed it to her. She read it slowly, her face unreadable. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. She said she didn't know who wrote it, but she wasn't surprised. She said Daniel had talked about a woman once, years ago, when he was sick, and the medications made him loose with his words. He said he had loved someone a long time ago, someone he had to leave behind. He never said why, never gave a name, just said he thought about her sometimes and wondered if she was all right. His sister had assumed it was a passing thing, a regret everyone carries. But seeing the letter, she thought maybe it had been more than that. I asked if there was anything else, any letters or photographs he might have kept. She shook her head. She said when he died, she sorted through his things and found almost nothing personal. A few tools, some clothes, a box of old pay stubs, no photographs, no letters, nothing that told a story beyond the practical facts of a working life. She said it was like he had erased himself or never let himself be known in the first place. She handed the letter back to me and said, "I think she meant a lot to him. I wish I could tell you more." I thanked her and stood to leave. She walked me to the door and said she was glad I came, glad to know he had been loved by someone, even if it was a long time ago. I drove back that night, the road empty and dark, the letter on the seat beside me. I thought about Daniel, about the life he had lived, quiet and unattached, carrying a piece of someone he couldn't have. I thought about my wife, who had built a life with me, who had been present and real and mine, but who had also kept this one corner of herself hidden. I did not know what to do with that knowledge or how to reconcile the two. When I got home, I put the letter and the photographs in a drawer in my desk. I did not throw them away, but I did not look at them again either. My son came by a week later, and we sat on the porch and talked about nothing in particular. He asked if I had found what I was looking for. I said I had found something, but I wasn't sure if it was what I needed. He nodded and didn't push. We sat in the quiet, the sound of the wind through the trees, the distant hum of traffic. I thought about the letter, about the name that didn't belong to anyone I knew, and I realized that some questions don't have answers, only the space where an answer might have been. I went back to the cabin a month later. I stood in the hearth where my son had found the letter and looked up at the stone chimney, the blackened bricks, the way the light came through the window and illuminated the dust in the air. I thought about burning the letter, finishing what my wife had started, but I didn't. I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope with the photographs. I took them home and put them in the file box in the basement, tucked beneath the deed and the tax records, the accumulated proof of a life built and lived. I still think about Daniel sometimes. I wonder what would have happened if he had stayed, if my wife had followed him, if the summer had stretched into something permanent. I wonder if she thought about him the way I think about her now, with a kind of distant tenderness, a recognition that some things are too complicated to reduce to simple truth. I do not know if what she felt for him diminished what she felt for me, or if it existed alongside it, separate but equally real. I think maybe both are true. I think maybe that is all right. The cabin still stands. I go there occasionally, usually alone, and I sit on the porch and listen to the quiet. I have not told my son the whole story, and I do not think I will. Some things belong to the people who lived them, and I do not think it is my place to decide what should be known and what should stay buried. What I do know is that she chose to build a life with me, and that life was real. The letter, the summer, the man in the photograph, they are part of the story, but they are not the whole of it. I am learning to live with that, to hold both truths at once without needing them to resolve into something simpler. The last time I was at the cabin, I found another piece of paper in the hearth, smaller than the letter, just a corner with a few words. I almost left it there, but I picked it up and turned it over. It said, in her handwriting, "I hope you found the words." I do not know who she meant or when she wrote it, or if it was meant for Daniel or for me or for no one at all. I folded it and put it in my wallet, and I carry it with me now, a fragment of something I will never fully understand.